Most people think angels are messengers, divine and untouchable. They think humans are helpless sinners, and the end is about destruction. One of the oldest Jewish texts tells a completely different story. The Book of Enoch, excluded from Western canon, preserved only in Ethiopia, and quietly ignored by most of Christianity, describes something most modern believers have never encountered. Once you realize what it actually says, you will never look at Judgment Day the same way again. Tonight, we're stepping into that forgotten cosmology. Not to redefine belief, but to understand what it claims and why it was erased. So let me know where you're watching from, and let's dive in. The Ethiopian Bible doesn't just tell stories, it assumes a framework, a cosmic architecture that predates the events it describes. Most religious texts start with God and humanity, two actors on one stage, but the Enochian worldview starts with three: God, angels, and humans. And here's the critical part. Each has a function, not a moral position, but a function. Angels aren't just messengers praising God in some celestial choir. They're administrators, overseers, beings assigned to maintain balance between the divine and material realms. Humans aren't just fallen creatures needing salvation. They're participants in a system that requires their alignment, not their obedience. Think of it like this: if heaven is the blueprint and earth is the structure, then angels are the foremen and humans are the builders. Everyone has a role, everyone has boundaries, and when those boundaries collapse, the entire system destabilizes. This is what the Book of Enoch describes: not a fall from grace, but a structural failure. The Ethiopian tradition preserved this framework because it never had to reconcile it with Roman imperial theology. It didn't need to fit angels into a binary of good or evil, didn't need to make humans helpless, didn't need to turn history into a morality play. Instead, it kept something older, a cosmology where Earth isn't humanity's private drama, but contested space, where history isn't linear progress toward salvation, but a long attempt to restore what was broken. Christ's return, in this framework, doesn't begin the story, it completes it. But to understand what he's completing, we have to go back, way back, to before the flood. Before kings and empires, before written law, to a moment when the boundaries between heaven and earth were intact, when angels stayed in their assigned roles, and humans lived within a cosmic order they understood. And then, something happened. Not a rebellion in the way we imagine rebellion, not a war in heaven, but something quieter, more insidious, a decision, a crossing, a transgression that didn't announce itself with trumpets or fire, but with desire. The Watchers saw something on earth, and they descended, not to destroy, but to teach, to intervene, to give humanity what it wasn't ready to receive. More on that later. This is where the story begins, not with Adam and Eve, not with Cain and Abel, but with Enoch, a man who walked between worlds, a witness to what heaven looked like before the crisis and what it became after. The Ethiopian Bible doesn't treat Enoch as allegory. It treats him as a historical figure, a record keeper, someone who saw the structure of reality and documented it, not for theologians, but for anyone willing to look. Because what Enoch saw wasn't doctrine, it was mechanism, the way heaven functioned, the way angels operated, the way humans were supposed to fit into a system far larger than themselves. And when that system broke, Enoch was there, not to fix it, but to write it down, so that when the time came for restoration, someone would remember what order looked like. So, who was Enoch really? Enoch doesn't fit the mold of a biblical prophet. He doesn't preach, doesn't deliver commandments, doesn't call people to repentance or threaten divine wrath. Instead, he does something far stranger. He disappears. Genesis gives us exactly 5 verses about him. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him. That's it. No explanation, no context, just gone. But the Book of Enoch expands that absence into something profound. Enoch didn't die. He was taken, lifted out of the material world and brought into the heavenly realms, not as a reward, but as a witness. He becomes a scribe, a recorder of cosmic events, someone who sees the structure of reality from the inside, and what he sees changes everything. Enoch describes multiple heavens, not metaphorically, but structurally, layers of existence, each with its own inhabitants, its own laws, its own function. He encounters angelic beings, some obedient, some rebellious, some awaiting judgment. He's shown the tablets of heaven, where the deeds of every human are recorded. He witnesses the chambers where souls await judgment, is taken to the ends of the earth where the firmament meets the abyss, sees the pillars that hold up the sky, the storehouses of the winds, the mechanisms by which the sun and moon move. This isn't poetry or mysticism. In the Enochian tradition, this is documentation. Enoch is recording what he observes, like an ancient astronaut describing technology he doesn't fully understand but knows is real. And here's what makes Enoch's testimony so unsettling. He's not a priest, not royalty, not chosen because of his virtue or wisdom. He's chosen because he's human, and what's about to unfold involves humanity directly. Heaven needs someone from earth to see it, record it, and carry the knowledge back. Enoch becomes the bridge, the only human to cross into the divine bureaucracy and return with information. He learns the names of angels, their ranks, their assignments. He learns which ones kept their posts and which ones abandoned them. He's shown the consequences of that abandonment, not in moral terms, but in structural ones. What happens when an administrator oversteps their role? What happens when knowledge meant for one realm leaks into another? What happens when the cosmic order that held everything together begins to fracture? Enoch witnesses the judgment of the Watchers, angels who descended to earth and violated the fundamental law of their existence. He sees them bound in darkness, awaiting final judgment at the end of days. He's told their names: Semyaza, Azazel, Arachiel, Kokabiel, leaders among the Watchers who led 200 angels in their descent. He watches as they plead their case, as they try to justify what they've done, and he records their failure. But Enoch doesn't just observe from a distance. He's given a role in this cosmic drama. The Watchers ask him to intercede on their behalf, to petition God for mercy, to argue that their intentions weren't malicious. And Enoch delivers their message, carries it to the throne itself, and returns with an answer that's both final and terrifying. There will be no mercy for those who knew the boundaries and crossed them anyway. This is the moment that defines the Enochian cosmology. The Watchers weren't cast out of heaven in some primordial rebellion before creation. They were serving their function, watching over humanity, and then they made a choice. They saw the daughters of men, found them beautiful, and decided to descend. They took human wives, produced offspring, and taught humanity knowledge that was never meant to cross the divide between heaven and earth. And Enoch is there to document all of it, not as a participant, but as the sole human witness to a cosmic crisis that would reshape the trajectory of history. He doesn't moralize, doesn't condemn, doesn't try to explain why this happened. He simply records what he sees. Angels who broke their covenant, humans who accepted what they offered, and a world that began to spiral into chaos as a direct result. What makes Enoch's testimony authoritative in this tradition isn't his righteousness or his prophetic gift. It's his proximity. He was there. He saw it. He walked through the heavenly courts, stood before the divine throne, witnessed the binding of the Watchers, and returned to earth with knowledge no other human possessed. And when he writes about the flood, about judgment, about the restoration that must come, he's not speculating based on visions or divine inspiration. He's reporting what he was explicitly shown. This is why the Book of Enoch was quoted freely by early Christians. It provided something no other text did: an eyewitness account of the cosmic order, its collapse, and the mechanism by which it would eventually be restored. Enoch wasn't a prophet predicting the future. He was a scribe documenting the present structure of reality and the crisis that had already begun to unfold. And this is crucial to understand. The Book of Enoch isn't some fringe text that emerged in the margins of religious history. In Second Temple Judaism, the period between the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 CE, the Book of Enoch was widely read, deeply influential, and treated as authoritative by many Jewish communities. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, indicating that the Essenes, one of the major Jewish sects of the time, considered it scripture. Early Christian writers quoted it directly, including the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament, which references Enoch's prophecy about the coming judgment almost word for word. So this wasn't an obscure text. It was mainstream. It shaped how people understood angels, judgment, and the cosmic order. And then it disappeared, at least from the Western Christian tradition. The Book of Enoch was excluded from the biblical canon as Christianity consolidated under Roman imperial authority. By the 4th century, when church councils were formalizing which texts would be considered scripture and which would be discarded, Enoch didn't make the cut. Not because it was considered false, but because it was considered problematic. It gave too much detail about the heavenly structure, made angels too fallible, implied that humans had a cosmic role beyond simple obedience, and worst of all, suggested that divine judgment was corrective rather than punitive. For a church aligning itself with empire, these ideas were dangerous. They decentralized authority, made cosmic order accessible without institutional mediation, and implied that restoration didn't require submission to ecclesiastical power. So Enoch was quietly removed, labeled apocryphal, and eventually forgotten in the West. But not in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never removed it. They kept it as part of their biblical canon, right alongside Genesis, Psalms, and the Gospels. For them, Enoch wasn't optional context or interesting historical background. It was essential to understanding how reality works. And because Ethiopia remained relatively isolated from Roman and later European Christian influence, they had no external pressure to conform their canon to Western standards. This is why, when European scholars rediscovered the Book of Enoch in the 18th century through Ethiopian manuscripts, it caused such a stir. Here was a text that had been lost to the West for over 1,000 years, preserved in its entirety by a Christian tradition that never accepted its removal. And when scholars began translating it, they found something astonishing. This wasn't just a collection of mystical visions or apocalyptic speculation. It was a coherent cosmology, a detailed account of heavenly structure, angelic hierarchy, and the mechanism by which divine judgment operates. The Book of Enoch is divided into several sections, written at different times but compiled into a unified whole. The Book of the Watchers describes the angels' descent and the corruption that followed. The Book of Parables presents Enoch's visions of the coming judgment and the role of the Messiah in restoration. The astronomical book lays out the structure of the heavens, the movement of celestial bodies, and the calendar by which cosmic time operates. The Book of Dreams recounts symbolic visions of history from creation to the final judgment. And the Epistle of Enoch delivers warnings and ethical instruction based on what Enoch witnessed. Taken together, these texts form a comprehensive framework for understanding the relationship between heaven, earth, angels, and humanity. They answer questions that Genesis leaves open. Where did evil come from? Why is the world broken? What role do angels play in human history? And most importantly, what does judgment actually accomplish? But here's what makes the Book of Enoch so different from other apocalyptic literature. It's not dualistic. It doesn't divide the world into forces of absolute good battling forces of absolute evil. The Watchers aren't demons in the way later Christian theology would define demons. They're angels who overstepped their function. The Nephilim aren't monsters in some mythological sense. They're the hybrid offspring of a boundary violation. And judgment isn't about separating the righteous from the wicked based on belief or moral purity. It's about removing what doesn't belong, restoring what was displaced, and reestablishing the cosmic order that held everything together before the Watchers descended. This is a fundamentally different way of thinking about divine judgment. It's not retributive. It's restorative. It's not about punishing sin. It's about correcting imbalance. And it's not about saving souls from hell. It's about repairing a system that broke down when boundaries dissolved and knowledge crossed realms it was never meant to enter. The Ethiopian tradition preserved this framework because it never had to fit Enoch into a theology of original sin, substitutionary atonement, or eternal damnation. Those concepts emerged later, shaped by Greek philosophy and Roman legal thinking. But Enoch predates all of that. It comes from a worldview where the cosmos has structure, where beings have roles and where history is the story of what happens when those roles are violated and how they eventually get restored. So when we read the Book of Enoch today, we're not reading fringe mythology. We're reading a text that was authoritative for centuries, that shaped how early Jews and Christians understood reality, and that was only removed because it didn't serve the political needs of an imperial church. Ethiopia kept it, and in keeping it, they preserved a cosmology the West chose to forget. Now we come to the heart of the crisis, the Watchers themselves. Who were they, what was their function, and what exactly did they do that fractured the cosmic order? The Watchers were not fallen angels in the way most people imagine fallen angels. They weren't cast out of heaven in some primordial rebellion alongside Satan before the creation of the world. That's a later theological construct, developed to explain the existence of evil in a monotheistic framework. The Watchers, according to the Book of Enoch, were functioning members of the heavenly hierarchy who had a specific assignment: to watch over humanity and observe the unfolding of creation without interfering. Their role was oversight, not intervention. They were meant to witness, to report back to the divine throne, to maintain the boundary between the celestial and terrestrial realms. Think of them as mediators stationed at the interface between heaven and earth, close enough to see both, responsible for maintaining the separation between them. This wasn't punishment or exile. It was their function within the cosmic bureaucracy. The heavenly hierarchy, as Enoch describes it, operates with precision. There are angels assigned to natural phenomena. Uriel governs the movements of celestial bodies. Raphael oversees healing and the spirits of men. Gabriel commands the forces of heaven, and Michael serves as the chief administrator, the one who executes divine judgment. Beneath these archangels are multiple orders of angels, each with specific domains: angels of the seasons, angels of the winds, angels who record human deeds, angels who guard the entrances to heaven. The system functions because everyone knows their role and stays within it. The Watchers were part of this structure. They held positions of authority, stationed on the boundaries of the material world with the responsibility of observation. But unlike other angelic orders, the Watchers had direct visual access to humanity. They watched humans live, struggle, build, fail, reproduce. And over time, something shifted. The Book of Enoch describes it plainly. And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. This is the transgression, not rebellion, not cosmic warfare, but desire, a crossing motivated not by malice, but by attraction. The Watchers saw the daughters of men and wanted them. They made a collective decision, led by Semyaza, who proposed the pact. I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. So they bound themselves by mutual oaths, 200 of them descending together to Mount Hermon, agreeing that if they were to violate the boundary, they would all be equally culpable. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of weakness or a single angel's mistake. It was a coordinated decision by a significant number of heavenly administrators who chose to abandon their posts, cross into the material realm, and take human wives. They descended, married human women, and produced offspring, beings that should never have existed, hybrids of celestial and terrestrial nature, the Nephilim. But here's what's crucial to understand. The problem wasn't that angels experienced desire or that humans were complicit in these unions. The problem was jurisdictional. Angels belonged to one realm, humans to another, and the boundary between them wasn't arbitrary. It was structural. Crossing it didn't just violate a rule, it destabilized the system itself. The offspring of these unions didn't fit into the cosmic order. They were anomalies, beings with angelic knowledge and power inhabiting material bodies, capable of acting in ways that disrupted the balance the entire system depended on. And the Watchers didn't stop at taking wives. Once they crossed the boundary, they began teaching humanity knowledge that was never meant to leave the celestial realm. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, breastplates, the weapons of war. Semyaza taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabiel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. This wasn't education. It was exposure. Knowledge that angels possessed as part of their function. Knowledge bound to the structure of the heavens, being handed to humans who had no framework for integrating it, no wisdom to wield it responsibly, no understanding of its consequences. The Watchers didn't corrupt humanity by making them evil. They corrupted humanity by giving them access to cosmic knowledge without cosmic maturity. And this is where the Enochian framework diverges sharply from later Christian theology. The problem wasn't human sin or moral failure. The problem was misplaced authority, knowledge in the wrong hands, power operating outside its proper domain. The Watchers violated the order of creation not by becoming evil, but by crossing a boundary that existed for structural, not moral reasons. They introduced celestial mechanics into terrestrial existence, and the result was chaos. Not because the knowledge itself was evil, but because it didn't belong there. The cosmic order wasn't a set of arbitrary rules handed down by an authoritarian god. It was a functional architecture, and the Watchers dismantled part of it. That's the crisis. That's what needed correcting. And the rest of human history, in the Enochian worldview, is the long process of containment, removal, and eventual restoration of what was broken when the Watchers descended. Now let's talk about the corruption they caused. The Watchers' descent didn't just introduce forbidden knowledge, it produced something that shouldn't exist: the Nephilim. These weren't ordinary children. The Book of Enoch describes them as giants, beings of immense size and strength, born from the union of angels and human women. But their physical stature wasn't the problem. It was what they represented. The Nephilim were hybrids, beings that belonged to neither heaven nor earth, possessing angelic knowledge encoded in material bodies. They were ontological violations, creatures that existed outside the cosmic order's design, and they were hungry. Enoch describes how the Nephilim consumed everything, and they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. They weren't just eating to survive, they were consuming creation itself, acting as parasites on a system that had no category for them. Their existence was inherently destabilizing because they operated with capacities that exceeded human limits, but lacked the restraint that governed angelic behavior. The Nephilim became warlords, tyrants, beings who used their hybrid nature to dominate both humans and the natural world. They took what they wanted, destroyed what resisted them, and left devastation in their wake. But this wasn't evil in some abstract moral sense. It was the inevitable result of beings existing outside their proper place in the cosmic structure. They had no role, no function, no boundary. They were anomalies, and anomalies destabilize systems. But the corruption didn't stop with the Nephilim themselves. The knowledge the Watchers taught spread through human civilization like a contagion. Azazel's instruction in metallurgy didn't just give humans the ability to forge tools, it gave them the capacity to wage war at scale. Before this, conflict was limited by technology. After this, humans could produce weapons designed specifically to kill other humans efficiently. The knowledge wasn't inherently evil, but humans weren't ready for it. They had the technology without the wisdom to restrain its use. Semyaza taught enchantments and root cutting, knowledge of how to manipulate the natural world through ritual and substances. This introduced a form of power that bypassed the natural order, allowing humans to exert influence over things they didn't understand. It wasn't magic in the fantasy sense, it was practical knowledge of how certain materials, plants, and rituals could affect consciousness and physical reality. But without understanding the broader system these practices operated within, humans used them recklessly. Armaros taught counter-enchantments, which sounds defensive until you realize what it implies. Knowledge of enchantments necessitated knowledge of how to undo them, which meant humans were now engaged in escalating conflicts using celestial techniques they barely understood. Barakiel taught astrology. not as a tool for understanding cosmic cycles, but as a means of predicting and manipulating events based on celestial positions. Kokabel taught the constellations, giving humans knowledge of the stars' movements, which sounds benign until you realize this was knowledge tied to how angels navigate and operate in the celestial realm. Each piece of knowledge the Watchers taught was functional at the angelic level. These were tools angels used to maintain the cosmos. But transplanted into human civilization, they became instruments of chaos. Humans had swords without understanding the consequences of organized violence. They had astrological knowledge without understanding the structure of time. They had power over nature without comprehending the systems they were disrupting. And here's the critical insight the Enochian framework offers. The problem wasn't that humans became immoral. The problem was that they gained access to knowledge they weren't ready for. Think of it this way. Giving a child access to industrial machinery isn't evil, but it's catastrophically irresponsible. The machinery functions perfectly in the hands of someone who understands its operation, its dangers, its proper use. In the hands of someone who doesn't, it becomes a source of harm. This is what the Watchers did. They handed humanity the operating manual for cosmic mechanisms without the maturity to use it wisely, and the result was predictable. Humans weaponized what they were taught. They used metallurgy to conquer. They used enchantments to dominate. They used astrology to claim authority. They used knowledge of the heavens to position themselves as mediators between the divine and the human, establishing priesthoods and power structures that claimed celestial sanction. The corruption wasn't just physical, it was structural. Human civilization began organizing itself around knowledge it didn't fully understand, creating systems of power based on partial access to cosmic mechanics. Kings claimed divine right based on astrological knowledge. Priests performed rituals they'd learned from the Watchers without understanding the celestial context. Warriors fought with weapons designed by beings who'd never intended them to be used this way. And at the center of it all were the Nephilim, beings who embodied the fundamental problem. They had power without place, knowledge without role, capacity without function. They couldn't be integrated into the cosmic order because they didn't belong there. They were artifacts of a boundary violation, and their mere existence was destabilizing everything around them. This is what Enoch witnessed, a world spinning into chaos because the structure that held reality together had been compromised. The Watchers crossed a boundary and triggered a cascade of dysfunction that threatened to collapse the entire system. Judgment, in this framework, wasn't about punishing sin. It was about removing what didn't belong before it destroyed everything else. Now, what about humanity's role in all of this? Here's where the Enochian framework challenges everything we typically assume about human nature and cosmic order. Humans weren't passive victims in this story, nor were they the primary antagonists. They were participants, caught between their terrestrial limitations and the celestial knowledge they'd been given access to. The Watchers crossed the boundary, but humans accepted what they offered. The daughters of men didn't resist the angels. They married them, bore their children, integrated them into human society. Human men didn't reject the knowledge the Watchers taught. They learned metallurgy, weaponized it, used it to establish dominance over other humans. The enchantments, the astrology, the manipulation of nature, all of it was received willingly, eagerly even, because it represented power. And this is the uncomfortable part. Humans weren't coerced. They saw what was being offered and recognized its value immediately. In the Enochian worldview, humans occupy a specific position in the cosmic order. They're not angels. They don't have direct access to celestial knowledge or power. But they're not merely animals either. They have consciousness, choice, the capacity to align with or against the structure of reality. Their role is participation, not administration. They're meant to live within the material realm, following the patterns established by the cosmic order, contributing to the unfolding of creation through their choices and actions. But participation requires something crucial: alignment. Not obedience to arbitrary rules, but alignment with the way things actually work. Think of it like a musician in an orchestra. The musician doesn't follow the conductor because the conductor is authoritarian. They follow because the conductor maintains the structure that allows the music to work. Each instrument has a role. Each section has a function. When everyone plays their part within the established structure, the result is harmony. When someone decides to play outside the structure, louder than their role requires, in a different key, at the wrong tempo, the whole thing falls apart. Humans in the Enochian framework are like musicians who were suddenly given access to the conductor's score, the composer's notes, and the acoustic engineering of the concert hall itself. They gained knowledge of how the whole system operates, but they were still sitting in the orchestra, still limited to their instruments, still bound by their position. The knowledge didn't elevate them to a different level of existence. It just gave them the capacity to disrupt the system more effectively. And disrupt it they did. With the knowledge the Watchers provided, humans began organizing civilization in ways that contradicted the cosmic order. They established hierarchies based on who had access to forbidden knowledge. They created priesthoods that claimed to mediate between heaven and earth using rituals learned from angels. They waged wars using weapons designed by celestial beings. They positioned themselves as if they had angelic authority while remaining fundamentally human. This created a cascading misalignment. Humans acting as if they were gods, claiming roles they weren't designed for, wielding power they didn't understand. And the result was exactly what you'd expect when any part of a system tries to function as something it's not. Breakdown, dysfunction, chaos. But here's what makes the Enochian perspective so different from later Christian theology. Humans didn't fall in some moral sense that required redemption through belief. They became misaligned, operating outside their proper function. So the problem wasn't sin as moral corruption. It was humans trying to operate at a level they weren't designed for. The Book of Enoch makes this explicit. When Enoch is shown the judgment that's coming, it's not described as punishment for wickedness. It's described as correction, as removal of what doesn't belong, as restoration of proper boundaries. The Nephilim must be eliminated because they're ontological violations. They literally shouldn't exist. The Watchers must be bound because they abandoned their posts. And humanity must be reset, brought back to its proper position within the cosmic order. This is why the flood becomes necessary in the Enochian framework. It's not divine anger or moral retribution, it's containment. The corruption introduced by the Watchers and perpetuated by humans had spread so thoroughly that there was no way to restore order without removing the generation that carried it. The flood washes away the immediate corruption, drowns the Nephilim, removes the generation that had integrated forbidden knowledge into their civilization. It's a cosmic reset button. But notice what the flood doesn't do. It doesn't eliminate evil, doesn't solve the fundamental problem, doesn't restore perfect order. The Watchers remain bound, but not destroyed. Their knowledge remains accessible in written form. The capacity for humans to misalign themselves with cosmic order remains intact. The flood is a containment measure, not a final solution. This is crucial. In the Enochian worldview, humans remain capable of misalignment because that's inherent to having choice. Alignment can't be forced. It has to be chosen. And choice means the possibility of choosing wrongly. So the cosmic order doesn't eliminate human agency. It establishes boundaries within which agency can operate without destabilizing the whole system. When those boundaries are violated, correction becomes necessary, not to punish, but to prevent total collapse. There's something deeply unsettling about the way the Book of Enoch treats knowledge. In most religious frameworks, knowledge is either good or evil based on its content. Sacred knowledge elevates, profane knowledge corrupts. But the Enochian perspective offers something more complex. Knowledge itself is neutral, but its accessibility is not. The problem isn't what the Watchers taught. It's that they taught it to beings who had no framework for integrating it responsibly. Consider Barakiel's teaching of astrology. At the angelic level, knowledge of celestial movements is operational. It's how angels navigate the heavens, understand cosmic time, coordinate their functions across vast distances. But when humans learned astrology, they used it to claim authority, to position themselves as mediators between heaven and earth, to establish priesthoods that extracted power from others by claiming special access to cosmic knowledge. The knowledge itself was accurate, The stars do move in patterns. Those patterns do correspond to cycles. But humans interpreted it through the lens of domination rather than integration. This is the psychological dimension the Book of Enoch illuminates. Knowledge without maturity is inherently destabilizing. Humans suddenly had capacities that exceeded their wisdom. The Book of Enoch describes this corruption spreading through generations. The children of the Nephilim grew up in a world where forbidden knowledge was normalized, where humans claimed angelic authority as if it were their birthright, where the boundaries between heaven and earth had become so blurred that no one remembered what proper order looked like. Knowledge that should have taken thousands of years of cosmic evolution to access was dumped into human civilization in a single generation, and the result was predictable. Humans began destroying themselves and the world around them at an accelerated rate. Here's the deeper psychological insight. This wasn't about ignorance. Humans weren't stupid or primitive. They were smart enough to recognize the value of what the Watchers taught, smart enough to apply it, smart enough to build civilizations around it. The problem was that intelligence without wisdom amplifies dysfunction. A clever person with immature consciousness doesn't make better choices. They make more elaborate mistakes. This is why the Enochian framework treats knowledge as dangerous in the wrong hands. Knowledge itself isn't bad, it just amplifies whatever trajectory consciousness is already on. The Watchers gave humans knowledge when human consciousness was fundamentally unprepared to integrate it, and the result was chaos that compounded with each generation. And this corruption wasn't just external, it became internal. Humans began to think of themselves differently. They developed what we might call spiritual arrogance, the belief that knowing celestial mechanics made them celestial, that understanding angelic techniques made them angelic. They confused information with transformation, technique with wisdom, knowledge with alignment. The Book of Enoch makes clear that this confusion was itself part of the corruption. Humans claiming to be more than they were, operating as if they occupied a different position in the cosmic order, wielding power they attributed to their own greatness rather than recognizing it as borrowed, stolen, or misappropriated from a realm they didn't belong to. This wasn't just moral failure, it was ontological confusion. Humans forgot what they were, and in forgetting, they became something monstrous. This is the cost of knowing without being ready to know. Not damnation in some theological sense, but disintegration, the fracturing of identity that comes from possessing knowledge that exceeds one's capacity to integrate it. Now, we come to the moment that defines the entire Enochian cosmology: judgment. But this isn't judgment in the way most religious traditions present it. This isn't about separating righteous souls from wicked souls, isn't about eternal reward or eternal punishment, isn't about God's anger finally erupting after tolerating human sin for too long. In the Book of Enoch, judgment is restoration, the systematic removal of what doesn't belong so that cosmic order can be re-established. Enoch has shown this judgment in advance. He witnesses the binding of the Watchers, sees them cast into darkness where they'll remain until the final day. He's told explicitly why this is happening. It's not about punishing evil. It's about removing anomalies, entities that exist outside the proper structure of creation. The Nephilim must be eliminated not because they're wicked, but because they're ontological violations. They shouldn't exist. They're the offspring of a boundary that was never meant to be crossed, and their presence destabilizes the entire cosmic system. So judgment begins with their removal, not through direct divine intervention, but by turning them against each other. The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim destroying one another in warfare, using the very violence and weapons their fathers taught them until they're wiped out. But eliminating the Nephilim isn't enough. The corruption they introduced, the knowledge the Watchers taught, the civilization humans built around that knowledge, all of it remains. The generation that received forbidden knowledge has integrated it so thoroughly that there's no way to extract it without removing the generation itself. This is where the flood becomes necessary. And here's where the Enochian perspective diverges sharply from how most people understand the biblical flood. This isn't divine rage drowning a wicked world. It's containment, a cosmic reset designed to remove the immediate corruption while preserving the possibility of restoration. Enoch describes the flood as necessary because the corruption had become genetic, not just cultural. The Nephilim weren't just culturally different from humans. They were biologically hybrid, beings whose very DNA represented a mixing of celestial and terrestrial that violated the structure of creation. Their offspring carried this corruption forward. Humans who'd married into Nephilim bloodlines carried it. The knowledge the Watchers taught had been encoded not just in texts and traditions, but in bloodlines that passed down both technique and the arrogance to use it. So the flood serves a specific function. It removes the biological corruption, drowns the hybrid bloodlines, eliminates the generation that had normalized the boundary violation. It's not punishment, it's quarantine. Imagine a computer system infected with malware that's spread through every file, every program, every process. The only way to restore function is to wipe the system and start from a clean backup. The flood is that wipe. Brutal, total, necessary. Now notice what survives. Noah and his family. But the reason they survive, according to the Enochian framework, isn't moral virtue. It's genetic purity. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. That phrase, perfect in his generations, is crucial. It means his bloodline hadn't been corrupted by Nephilim admixture. He was fully human, uncontaminated by the hybrid genetics that had spread through most of humanity. This is why he's chosen. Not because he's righteous in some moral sense, but because he represents an uncorrupted human bloodline that can restart civilization without carrying forward the biological consequences of the Watcher's transgression. The flood removes what doesn't belong, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem. The Watchers remain bound but not destroyed. Their final judgment is delayed until the day of the great consummation. The knowledge they taught remains accessible. Noah himself carries forward some of it, the knowledge necessary to rebuild civilization, but presumably without the weaponized applications. And most importantly, human nature remains unchanged. Humans still have the capacity to misalign themselves with cosmic order, still have the freedom to choose disorder over alignment. This is critical to understanding the Enochian view of judgment. It's not a one-time event that solves everything forever. It's a corrective intervention in an ongoing process. The flood removes the immediate corruption, but it doesn't eliminate the possibility of future corruption. It resets the system, but humans remain free to misalign themselves again. Judgment in this framework isn't final. It's periodic, corrective, necessary whenever the system destabilizes beyond a certain threshold. Enoch is shown multiple judgments, not just the flood. He witnesses the binding of the Watchers as one judgment, the destruction of the Nephilim as another, the flood as a third, and finally the great judgment at the end of days when the Watchers will face their final sentence. Each judgment addresses a specific aspect of the corruption. The Watchers are removed from their positions, the Nephilim are eliminated, the corrupted generation is wiped out, and eventually the Watchers themselves will be permanently removed from existence. Not because they deserve eternal punishment, but because they cannot be rehabilitated. They knew the boundaries and crossed them anyway. There's no place for them in a restored cosmos. This reframes the entire concept of divine judgment. It's not about God's anger or justice in some abstract moral sense. It's about system maintenance. Judgment is the mechanism by which order is restored through removal of what doesn't belong, containment of what can't be integrated, and reset of systems that have become too corrupted to function. And this explains something crucial: why evil persists even after judgment. The Watchers are bound, but spiritual forces that opposed order from the beginning remain active. The Nephilim are destroyed, but human capacity for misalignment remains. The corrupted generation is removed, but knowledge can be rediscovered, boundaries can be crossed again, disorder can re-emerge. This is why restoration, in the Enochian worldview, requires more than judgment. It requires something that can address the underlying problem: humanity's tendency to misalign itself. Judgment removes the immediate corruption, but it doesn't solve human nature. And this is where Christ enters the Enochian framework, not as someone who appeases God's anger or pays a debt humanity owes, but as someone who addresses what judgment alone cannot fix: the restoration of proper alignment between humanity and cosmic order. So what does alignment actually mean in this ancient cosmology? Because this is where the Enochian framework offers something radically different from how most religious traditions talk about human responsibility. Alignment isn't obedience. It's not following commandments handed down by religious authorities. It's not belief in correct doctrines or subscription to specific theological positions. In the Enochian worldview, alignment is something closer to what we might call resonance, living in a way that harmonizes with the actual structure of reality rather than working against it. Think of it like this: a river flows downhill because of gravity. You can try to make it flow uphill, but you'll fail. You can dam it, redirect it, manipulate its course temporarily, but the fundamental direction is determined by forces larger than human will. Alignment, in the cosmic sense, means recognizing those forces and working with them rather than against them. It means understanding your position in the structure and operating within it rather than pretending you occupy a different position. For humans in the Enochian framework, alignment means several things. First, it means recognizing that you're human, not angelic. You don't have direct access to celestial knowledge or power. You're not a mediator between heaven and earth. You don't possess cosmic authority just because you've learned techniques or gained information. Your position is terrestrial, and trying to function as if you're celestial creates misalignment that destabilizes both you and the system around you. Second, alignment means using knowledge appropriately to your level of consciousness. This doesn't mean remaining ignorant. It means recognizing that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. When you gain information, you have a responsibility to integrate it, to develop the maturity to wield it responsibly, to understand its implications before applying it. The Watchers gave humans knowledge without wisdom, and the result was chaos. Alignment means refusing to operate that way, gaining knowledge and wisdom together, allowing consciousness to develop at a pace that matches the power you're accessing. Third, alignment means recognizing that you exist within an interdependent system. Your choices affect others. Your actions ripple through the structure. You're not an isolated individual making independent decisions in a vacuum. You're part of a cosmic order, and your alignment or misalignment contributes to the stability or instability of the whole. This isn't moral obligation in some abstract sense. It's structural reality. When you misalign, you create friction in the system. When you align, you contribute to its function. But here's what's crucial: alignment cannot be forced. This is why judgment alone can't solve the problem. You can remove corrupted elements, reset systems, contain anomalies, but you cannot force beings with consciousness and choice to align themselves. Alignment has to be chosen freely, or it isn't alignment. It's just coerced conformity, which creates its own forms of dysfunction. This is the dilemma the Enochian framework identifies. Humans have the freedom to misalign themselves. That freedom is essential to their nature. But misalignment creates instability that threatens the entire cosmic order. You can't eliminate the freedom without eliminating what makes humans human. But you can't allow unlimited misalignment without the system eventually collapsing. So what's the solution? In ancient cosmology, the solution involves something that can bridge the gap between human freedom and cosmic order. Something that can demonstrate alignment so clearly that it becomes an available template. A visible example of what it looks like when a human lives in perfect resonance with the structure of reality. This is where the concept of a messianic figure becomes functionally necessary, not theologically invented. If alignment can't be forced but must be chosen, then humans need to see what alignment actually looks like. They need a model, a demonstration, a reference point that isn't abstract divine commandments, but concrete human embodiment of cosmic order. The Enochian framework describes this need explicitly. After the flood, humanity starts again, but the same patterns begin to emerge. Humans build civilizations, gain knowledge, claim authority, misalign themselves. The cycle continues because removing corruption doesn't change human nature. Judgment corrects immediate problems, but doesn't address the underlying pattern. What's needed is something that can show humans how to align themselves voluntarily, not through force. not through fear of punishment, not through promise of reward, but through recognition that alignment is how reality actually works, and that misalignment creates suffering regardless of what religious authorities say or don't say. This is alignment as descriptive, not prescriptive. It's not about should or ought, it's about is. Reality has a structure. Humans exist within that structure. When they operate in harmony with it, things work. When they operate against it, things break down. Alignment is the recognition of this fact and the choice to live accordingly. But this requires something humans hadn't seen before. A demonstration of what perfect alignment looks like in human form. Not an angel telling humans what to do. Not a divine being operating with powers humans don't possess, but a human, fully human, bound by human limitations, subject to human conditions, who nevertheless manages to live in perfect resonance with cosmic order. This is what the Enochian tradition was waiting for. Not someone to pay a debt or satisfy divine anger. Someone to show that human alignment with cosmic order is actually possible, that it can be done, that it looks like this. Someone who could bridge the gap the Watchers created, not by teaching forbidden knowledge, but by demonstrating how to integrate knowledge and wisdom, power and restraint, human nature and cosmic function. Now we come full circle to the question that connects this video to the last. Why does Christ matter in an Enochian worldview? If we understand the Enochian framework, angels who failed their function, humans who received knowledge they weren't ready for, a cosmic order that fractured when boundaries dissolved, judgment that removed corruption but didn't solve the underlying pattern, then Christ's role becomes structurally clear rather than theologically mysterious. Christ in this framework isn't coming to die for humanity's sins in some transactional atonement. He's coming to restore what the Watchers broke. And the way he does this is precise, addressing each specific aspect of the corruption the Watchers introduced. First, the Watchers taught forbidden knowledge, knowledge that crossed from the celestial realm into the terrestrial without proper preparation or context. Christ, according to the Ethiopian tradition, reveals proper knowledge, not secret techniques or cosmic mechanics humans aren't ready for, but wisdom about how to live in alignment with reality's structure. The difference is crucial. The Watchers gave humans knowledge that elevated their capabilities without elevating their consciousness. Christ offers wisdom that elevates consciousness to match the knowledge humans already possess. Second, the Watchers violated boundaries between heaven and earth. They descended when they should have stayed in their assigned positions, crossed into the material realm when they were meant to maintain separation. Christ operates differently. He doesn't violate the boundary, he embodies it properly. Third, the Watchers introduced knowledge that corrupted creation, techniques for warfare, methods of manipulation, ways of extracting power from the natural world that violated its inherent order. Christ, in the Ethiopian texts, brings purification and restoration, not by undoing what the Watchers taught, but by demonstrating how to use knowledge in alignment with cosmic order rather than against it. He shows that power doesn't require domination, that knowledge doesn't necessitate exploitation, that humans can possess significant understanding without using it to destabilize the system. Fourth, the Watchers produced the Nephilim, hybrid beings that existed outside the cosmic order's design, entities that had to be eliminated because they couldn't be integrated into any functional structure. Christ addresses this by demonstrating what proper integration looks like. He's not a hybrid in the way the Nephilim were. He's not half angel, half human, an unstable mixture that belongs nowhere. He's fully human and fully divine in a unified way, showing that connection between realms doesn't have to produce monsters. It can produce alignment when done properly. And finally, the Watchers' transgression required judgment, removal, containment, correction. But judgment alone couldn't solve the pattern because humans remained free to misalign themselves. Christ addresses this by providing what judgment can't, a template for voluntary alignment. He doesn't force humans to align with cosmic order. He demonstrates what that alignment looks like in practice so that humans can choose it freely. This is why Christ's return in the Ethiopian tradition is described as restoration rather than destruction. He's not coming back to annihilate the world in anger or to rescue believers from a doomed planet. He's coming to complete what he started, the full restoration of cosmic order that was fractured when the Watchers descended. His first coming addressed humanity's need for a model of alignment. His return addresses the cosmic need for full reintegration of all elements, heaven, earth, angels, humans, into their proper positions within the structure. The Book of Enoch describes this final restoration as involving multiple elements: the final judgment of the Watchers, the resurrection of the righteous dead, the establishment of a new heaven and new earth where proper boundaries are maintained, and the presence of divine order dwelling directly within the material realm without destabilizing it. Christ is central to this process, not because he's the only divine being involved, but because he's the only one who bridges the realms properly, who can operate in both without corrupting either. This is cosmic continuity, not theological invention. The problem began with angels crossing boundaries improperly and giving humans knowledge they weren't ready for. The solution involves a figure who can cross boundaries properly and give humans wisdom they are ready for. The Watchers descended and corrupted. Christ incarnates and restores. The Watchers taught techniques that weaponized human potential. Christ teaches wisdom that integrates human potential with cosmic order. In the Ethiopian tradition, which preserved Enoch alongside the Gospels, these aren't separate stories that need to be reconciled through theological gymnastics. They're one continuous narrative, the fracturing of cosmic order through boundary violation and the restoration of that order through proper boundary integration. Christ matters in this framework because he addresses, specifically and structurally, what the Watchers broke. The Ethiopian tradition preserved something most of Christianity chose to forget: a cosmology where heaven, earth, and humanity are interconnected parts of a single functioning system, where angels are fallible administrators rather than perfect servants, where humans are responsible participants rather than helpless sinners, and where judgment is corrective intervention rather than final condemnation. This is a sophisticated framework that treated cosmic order as mechanical rather than moral, that understood dysfunction as structural rather than purely ethical, that recognized the dangers of knowledge without wisdom, long before modern civilization rediscovered them through nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, and genetic engineering. The Book of Enoch describes what happens when beings with power don't have the wisdom to wield it responsibly. When knowledge crosses boundaries it wasn't meant to cross. When those tasked with maintaining order instead participate in its destruction. It describes a world where good intentions aren't enough, where cosmic mechanics matter more than moral purity, where the structure of reality itself has requirements that can't be violated without consequences. Christianity didn't reject Enoch because it was strange or obviously false. Christianity rejected it because it made institutional authority unnecessary. If cosmic order is mechanical rather than moral, then you don't need priests to mediate between God and humans. If judgment is corrective rather than punitive, then you don't need salvation theology. If alignment is chosen rather than imposed, then you don't need ecclesiastical control. The Book of Enoch was dangerous because it suggested that anyone who understood the structure of reality could align themselves with it directly, without institutional mediation. Ethiopia kept it, and in keeping it, they preserved a worldview where Christ's return isn't about rescuing believers from a doomed planet, but about completing the restoration of a cosmic order that fractured when angels descended and humans accepted what they offered. It's not a story about faith overcoming doubt or righteousness defeating wickedness. It's a story about structure, what happens when it breaks, how long it takes to repair, and what's required to restore it. Not as a belief to adopt, but as a framework history chose not to keep. So what do you think of Enoch's description of Judgment Day as restoration rather than punishment? Does this framework explain why evil persists despite the flood reset? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you're enjoying this series, leave a like, a hype, and join us for the next chapter. There's a lot more to explore. Until next time, keep questioning.